Hey everyone, welcome to Arcane Station. I'm your host, Mike Porter. Tonight we are going to talk about a location that is probably one of the most secretive and one of the most remote pieces of land you'll ever hear about, and that is, of course, Antarctica. And over the course of years, I've heard many weird tales about Antarctica, and so what I thought I'd do is just talk a little bit about what I've heard and talk about some of the conspiracies around Antarctica and how that remoteness kind of tends to allow for conspiracy to thrive and grow. Now, I'm not saying the conspiracy is wrong because, as everyone knows, conspiracy theory becomes conspiracy fact when things actually transpire. For instance, MK Ultra, as I said in my AI podcast, the government, tries to cover up and obfuscate facts by calling it conspiracy when in fact there is things that are happening that people have a hint of, and then sort of game it out in their heads to a logical conclusion. But for years it's called conspiracy theory until the documents are released and you find out that it is in fact a fact about that evidence, right? So here we are talking about Antarctica. Now, the first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about pop culture in that respect. Antarctica makes a really good location for mystery and intrigue and sci-fi, actually. And one of the absolute best films from that area and what I love is John Carpenter's The Thing, the 1980s version. And what I love about that is the rawness of the environment, the isolation. There's no help coming, and it's so foreign. It's almost like another planet. It's so incredibly dangerous there in terms of just environmental hazard, during the wintertime. And if you look at other movies that have used that same location, if you remember Transformers, Megatron was frozen beneath the Antarctic ice. He had, crashed on Earth, most likely when it was a tropical area inside of the Antarctic region, and then it became iced over, and he was captured under, a mile of ice at least, right? And once it was discovered, there was a government program to extract, Megatron, but also the Allspark, right, the cube that powers these creatures, these Transformers. And if you go back and look at H.P. Lovecraft work, you'll find at the Mountains of Madness, there's an ancient civilization buried beneath the ice, and of course, that's where Cthulhu mythos comes along. This cosmic horror, this cosmic godlike creature that is buried in the ice, in the mountains in Antarctica. And then, of course, you have the X-Files. Antarctica was tied to a hidden biological and government secret program there. And so you see that these shows tended to use this area because it's remote, it's isolated, it's hidden, and it's unverifiable, right? Like you can't actually go there yourself and verify a thing that's happened there, right? Because there's restrictions around who can actually go to Antarctica itself, and then there's restricted areas within Antarctica itself that other people cannot go. Even if you have access to the continent, you don't have access to visit all of it. And it's a real danger to do so. Like there's crevices or crevasses, however you want to say it, that are, could be a mile deep, and packed with snow over the top that would not support your weight, and therefore you could fall down. And there's been incidents where people have fallen into these things and not been able to be pulled out. So what's really true about Antarctica is that for the most part, the ice sheet over Antarctica is over a mile thick, and there are different systems in terms of weight and depths of the ice. So the eastern side is more thick and packed than the western side, because the western side has some volcanic activity underneath the ice sheet, and so therefore there's lots of variation in the depth and I guess the strength of the ice. And it also has subglacial systems. So, for instance, there's a place called Lake Vostok, and it's a water system under pressure and isolation, and it's a liquid under all of this ice, which is really weird to think about, and that's because it has this different thermal sort of shielding, I guess, and that liquid water is protected, I guess, by the compressing and the heat created by that compression. And there's allegedly over 400 lakes beneath the ice, and active, like liquid. And there's heat beneath the ice, so there's melt zones and there's uneven subsurface activity. And a lot of times when they're surveying using this thermal stuff, they get these pockets of heat that probably shouldn't be there, but because of the thermal compression and because of the volcanic activity, you have these variations in temperature. And there's also dry valleys. They're ice-free regions that exist. Although they're extremely limited and localized, what's interesting is that they're actually empty of ice. So it's really, and I don't know if that's a thermal reaction, again, like the ground heating up, causing this area to not have any ice, but there are these sort of desert-like areas that don't contain any ice sheets in that space. Now, there's lots of information coming out from Antarctica. One of the things that people have seen on the ground, but also through satellite imagery, are these pyramids. They're called nunataks, and it's a possibility that some of these could be man-made structures. Now, science is saying, obviously, that these are natural formations based on erosion and the way that the ice causes these things to take place. However, there's some very interesting, highly structured-looking mountains, if that's the case, and pyramidical in shape. There's also these walls and ridges, which feel almost structured as well. And some satellite imagery looks like there's actually previously structures there. There's like these really rectilinear shapes and shadows that come from, when the sun's hitting it in a certain way, that the angle of that light looks like there's a rectangular space there on the ground. Now, I haven't done a lot of combing the entirety of Antarctica through the satellite imagery, but I have seen those pyramid-type shapes before. Now, what's really interesting, there's some map paradoxes that take place. Early maps show this sort of southern land masses that were part of Antarctica that are no longer being shown. And I think what took place is in these earlier maps, when people were doing the surveying of the land, perhaps calving of icebergs caused these, maybe large-scale calving of icebergs created these sort of southern land masses, or the thought that this was a southern land mass, because the ice cap is shedding or breaking off chunks of ice all the time, and therefore some of these pieces could be quite large and appear to be like a landmass. And so perhaps in early mapping processes, the maps had these paradoxical sort of additional land spaces that weren't necessarily there once people began surveying with more modern equipment or going to visit the location. So it's a possibility that that was one of the things that took place. Now, there's I'm not a flat Earth person. I'll say that. I am a conspiracy theorist, but I will not say that the Earth is flat. What I will say is there's a difference between flat Earth, like it's a disk that's just floating out in space, what many flat earthers believe, I think, and I could be wrong here, but I think many flat earthers think that we are just in a flat section of a much larger space, and we're being confined into a section of that much larger space, and it's flat in that respect, not necessarily flat, not necessarily like a map on a table. And again, this is me just sort of thinking through what they might be thinking, because one of the things that they talk about are many sort of flat Earth type environments outside of our own, and it's separated by an ice wall. And they say that all these lands exist beyond that. So, I can see where people would look at these giant ice walls and go, hey, there's something beyond there, and I'm not allowed to go there, therefore there's something beyond that. But I think really there's ice shelves, and again, these are large sort of wall-like shapes that take place, and there's restricted access to those. So, you see images of this, and then you're like, hey, that looks like a structure, or that looks like something that is containing something else, and I want to go check it out, but you can't because you don't have clearance, and multiple nations have a treaty about what can be done on Antarctica. So it becomes difficult to verify whether or not something is beyond that ice wall. Another conspiracy is that there are hidden civilizations beneath the ice. And because of Lake Vostok and things like that, there's subglacial environments that could be used as habitats. And there are real lakes, and there's real geothermal heat that provides a livable space. And so that's the possibility that people could look at and go, hey, I think because of this, there could be an ancient civilization. And if you look at the world overall, there are areas of the world that used to be, like for instance, Utah. There's many structures there that show that it used to be under oceans. The structure of the rocks of those spaces, that used to be an ocean and then dried out. The Sahara used to be tropical. It used to have trees and vegetation and all that stuff. And of course, it dried out. And so our Earth is constantly cycling through all of these different environmental movements of heat and cool. And there's been many ice ages. I don't think there's just been one. There's been many rises in temperature and falls in temperature. And I think we're actually in a cool period right now. We are warming, but we're in a cool period right now. And again, it's part of this really long cycle. The Earth, when you look at how the environment is reacting to this stuff, quite possibly we are adding to the heating or cooling through our intervention. But what I will say is that the Earth has really long movements of heat and cool, and time runs different for Earth than it does for humans. We're here for a microsecond compared to the Earth's billions of years. And when you think about how something moves over time, like a tree, if you sat and watched a tree for a day, you won't see it grow. If you sat and watched a tree for 30 years, you'll see it grow. And it's sort of the same thing, but a much larger scale with the Earth. You could watch the ice ages come and go. You could watch, the temperature rise and fall. And so I think we do have some minor impact on stuff, but it's very minimal compared to the Earth's just natural cycle going through all these heating and cooling processes. There are structures underneath the water in the ocean next to South America, I think Cuba, that look pyramidical in shape. And so that would tell me during an ice age, all of the water that's being sucked up into these ice caps allowed for the coastlines to be much lower than they are currently, right? And so if we were going to go through another massive ice age, a lot of the water would be pulled up to the ice caps in freezing and would lower the overall water level globally, right? And so these structures that are 60, 80, 100 feet underwater would have been above that water line, okay? Now, there's other creature cryptids out there. There's these creatures called the Ninjin, which is a Japanese creature, and it's said to be this large, white, humanoid type creature with no arms, and it has legs, and it just sort of swims in the water, and they're massive. So that's another conspiracy there. There's a conspiracy about this operation that took place with Admiral Byrd in Antarctica, and it was called Operation High Jump, and I'm just going to do a really quick touch on it. But basically, they said that they encountered an unknown craft, and there was loss of life and loss of equipment by the Americans when they went down there. Now, there's another one that took place that was when Buzz Aldrin went down to Antarctica. He tweeted out, "We are all in danger. It is evil itself." But what is he talking about? So we don't really know, right? And so that's what made me want to take a look a little bit more about how Antarctica is being viewed, right? So I'm going to go a little bit deeper on some of these things. So let's talk about water where it shouldn't be. So in the 1950s and 1970s, they had these seismometers, and they were doing these seismic charge readings, and they found that they thought that there would be these pockets underneath the ice. And then in the 1990s, they used radar to confirm what they thought they knew in the 70s, right, through these seismic machines. And that's really interesting how, like we think we know something, and then science will come in and confirm when the technology is available for that, right? So again, there's 400 plus lakes underneath Antarctic. And Lake Vostok is the one that's been the most studied, and there's been core samples and things like that have gone down there, and it's really deep underground, and so it's very difficult to get to. However, there's liquid water under kilometers of ice, and there, people think that there might be these other tunnels or cavities. When they first started doing these seismic readings, they were like, wonder if there is this civilization under there that had built these cavities and these tunnels to provide space for their living. However, when they went and looked with the radar, they found that these were actually pockets of water. And again, I think the compression causes this sort of thermal pocket to allow the water to remain fluid in that space, and probably melts off a bit from the ice pack above it. And like I said, there's these geothermal volcanic systems beneath western Antarctica, and they have melt zones and ice thinning from below, and they have these thermal anomalies. And the data shows that these are uneven, active subsurface sections where the heat is, this variance is causing these pockets. One of the things I talked about before is these dry valleys, and McMurdo Base is in one of these dry valleys, and that's a research station there where they take and have this area where people can live during a certain portion of the year to study things like penguins or environmental science and things like that. Another thing that took place quite a while ago, prior to some of the more current technology, is Google Earth satellite data was showing these green valleys within Antarctica. And people were speculating that how could this coldest place on Earth somehow have vegetation? And what was found out is that there were compression anomalies on the data that was causing this issue of creating these green valleys, these pockets of vegetation, and I'm using air quotes while I'm talking to you. Basically, they thought that there were these pockets of vegetation, which found out later on. And again, we're having to completely rely and trust in the fact that Google is giving us the latest, most greatest updated data. And the reason why I say that is just like in NASA imagery, everything is touched. They'll do false color imagery to make it more interesting. They will airbrush stuff out if they don't want you, and this has happened multiple times, so I'm not just being a conspiracy theorist about this. They are actually actively adjusting imagery rather than showing us the raw information all the time. So the same thing could be happening with Google, and blind faith in anything is just silly. So it's great to be, for me, it's great to be skeptical about these things. Now, there's some other really interesting information about Antarctica, and the reason why many people were interested in it is from a very early time. There were active attempts to live or to create a base on Antarctica, and one of those was by the Nazis. So during World War II, between 1938 and 1939, they had an Arctic expedition there, and the region that they were looking at was called New Schwabenland. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to create a new homeland for the Aryan race, allegedly Aryan race, because there's not one. But basically what they had is they had German aerial photography, and they had reports of ice-free areas, and again, that's where McMurdo is. Another thing that happened is that during the end of the war, they were trying to capture as many German scientists as they could. But what was interesting is that some of the scientists were missing that should have been there, and that could be a possibility that the Russians also took some of the German scientists. But what people were speculating is that these German scientists were actually at New Schwabenland, and my thought is that if there is a space there, then they have an underground or underwater submarine base and an underground base, because they have those thermal vents and things like that to actually warm a space. So it's a possibility that there could have been a space there. Now, the expedition is very real. They wanted to establish Queen Maud Land or New Schwabenland as a new space for Germans. But there's no evidence of permanent base construction. But this myth grew, mainly after World War II through speculative literature. I even have a game idea that I wrote up many years ago about basically this New Schwabenland area. They built a secret base, and they were in contact with aliens, and that's why you had the interesting UFOs, and I'm trying to remember the name of the actual UFO, Hannibal. The technical drawings of Nazi UFOs called Hannibal and Hannibal 2 and up to 4 or 5, I think. These massive saucer-shaped UFOs that the Germans were either building or intended to build. And so in the game idea, the Germans were interfacing with aliens because the aliens obviously are living under the Antarctic ice. So that was the whole concept of the game, and I thought that would have been a really interesting space to make a first-person shooter, is under the glacial ice in a Nazi submarine base. So, like I said, Operation High Jump, the U.S. Navy fought UFOs during Operation High Jump, and that's the claim. And the expedition was forced to retreat. So, and this came about in UFO books and documentaries in the 1960s. And the evidence claimed is that Admiral Byrd quotes about threats from polar regions and early termination of the mission. So Operation High Jump was real, and aircraft accidents and weather problems were documented, but there's no contemporaneous records mentioning UFO combat. But he did say that there were threats beyond our current technology, is what he actually said. And so that's where it kind of becomes this interesting concept that there could be this UFO base or this underwater UFO UAP base that could be interacting during World War II when we had a large-scale operation that was going on at the time. So there's another thing that's really interesting. So there's this claim that there's this ancient map that shows the regions of Antarctica ice-free, which no person should have been able to see, because at the time of most sailboat technology, the Antarctic ice was already there. But this map not only shows that Antarctica is ice-free, it also has proof of advanced civilization on this map. And this is the interpretation of the Piri-Reis map, Pirireis. And that was discovered, or that was said to have been drawn up in 1513. And had these coastlines were interpreted as Antarctica, and when you kind of map it up and look at it, it sort of does look like the same structure of Antarctica. But what most people now believe is that this map shows South America, and that the ancient civilization that was advanced would have been Olmec, Aztec, Inca, depending on when that happened. And I think Olmecs are the oldest, with the technology of pyramid building. Pardon me. So Antarctica's interpretation is debated still, because they don't know if this is actually Antarctica or if it's South America. But if you think about continental drift and things like that, the concept of Pangea, where islands, the continents drifted apart from one another, the possibility that the outline of South America kind of matches with the outline of Antarctica could be feasible. I don't know if that was part of the actual drift that happened, or where those lines of volcanic activity that pushes those tectonic plates apart. I don't know if that's in that area, but the way I look at it is if it's not Antarctica, then it's a sort of mirror's edge of what Antarctica's coastline is, because of that tectonic movement. So Antarctica, like I said before, is heavily restricted because people think that there's something important there. And Antarctica has a treaty with restrictions on free movement through the space. And the travel is extremely limited, and research permits are required. You can't just go visit. You have to have a permit. And this mainly may be due to environmental protection and safety, but there could be things, and again, the interior of Antarctica could be filled with really dangerous gaps in the space that would swallow up dog sled teams or snowcats or any sort of travel through there. You could fall through in a chasm. You could, have this, even on the interior that looks safe, you could fall through the ice. So you could be stuck in a blizzard. The weather there is extremely unpredictable. It could, even in spring or spring or summer, there could be really anomalous weather that could trap you or cause you to freeze to death. So around that area, in New Zealand, we were really close to Antarctica in the South Island. They called it the Roaring 40s, the 40th latitude. The winds are really aggressive. I saw in Wellington, which is very windy. When we were flying into Wellington, many times we came in sideways on the airplane, and I've seen a grown person having to crawl against the wind to get where they were going on the sidewalk because the wind was so strong it was pushing them backwards. And I've even been there. I was standing outside of the Weta workshop with a friend who worked there, and we were talking about the trolls that are outside the Weta workshop caves, and it felt like somebody actually pushed me in my back, and that wind almost knocked me off my feet. And he goes, "Oh, I guess we better go inside." It was just the wind, but it felt like a physical push from someone. So the winds down there are massive, and so I would imagine even when it's sort of a warm day, if that wind picks up all that cool air above the ice, that could really drop the temperatures rapidly. So I understand why there's this thought that, this place is restricted for safety. I understand that. But at the same time, that gap of being able to actually go and visit yourself creates a lot of the conspiracy that we have, right? And a lot of the doubt about the reality of what's going on down there. So here's my thought process. I think Antarctica does have some strangeness there. I do think there is. I do think that it's a real place with extreme temperatures, and it's difficult to access, and that difficulty creates these thoughts that things are being hidden from you. And the environment, because of the snow and the blizzards and the wind and all that stuff, it removes any evidence. You'll see that there used to be, or there is sometimes, whaling stations there, but that have been blown over and within a few years are almost gone. So that creates another limited means of observation, because most of it's just white and covered with snow or ice. And in just a season, some of the things that have been structurally built there could be gone. There is real secrecy there. There is real restricted access. There is real controlled movement, and there's real mediated information that is given out of Antarctica and not given out freely. So there's a mediation between what happens and what you're told. But that doesn't confirm the theories, but it does explain why that theory, or the series of theories about Antarctica, exists. So here's what I think. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, but in Antarctica, right now, the fiction of that place is already strange enough. Okay, that's all I have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's not the typical one with cryptids and all that stuff, except for the Ninja. And I will continue to do more cryptid stuff. If you like where I'm going with this podcast, please let me know. I would be really grateful. I have a Patreon. You can find me on Arcane Station Podcast. You can capture this podcast, obviously, on most podcatchers. I have a Facebook page, Arcane Station. I have a YouTube channel, Arcane Station. And I have an Instagram. Follow me on all of those things. Interact with me. Let's have a conversation. You have an amazing night.